Listen, can you hear it? Beneath the city of light, beneath the bustling cafes and the wide tree-lined boulevards, there is another Paris, a city of silence, of eternal night. And if you listen very, very closely, past the drip of water, past the sigh of the earth, you can hear them, the whispers. They don't speak in words, not really. It's a feeling, a chill that isn't from the damp air, a sense of a presence just over your shoulder, in the corner of your eye that remains stubbornly, terrifyingly empty. This is the story not of the dead, but of what happened when the dead were disturbed, when 6 million souls were evicted from their graves and stacked like firewood in the dark. This is the story of the bone whisperers of the Paris Catacombs. Our story begins not in the darkness, but in the blinding, suffocating stench of the sun. Paris, 1780, the year the dead finally declared war on the living. Imagine the parish of Les Innocents, the city's oldest and most overcrowded cemetery. For centuries, it had served as the final resting place for generations of Parisians. But by the late 18th century, it was less a sacred ground and more a festering wound in the heart of the city. The ground, saturated with decomposing matter, rose 30 feet above the surrounding streets. Mass graves known as charniers were piled high, often left open to the elements. The air was thick with the smell of mephitis, the foul gas of decay. It was a smell that clung to your clothes, your hair, the back of your throat. It was a smell that could kill. We have the account of a police lieutenant tasked with investigating a complaint from the residents living in the shadow of Les Innocents. He describes a cellar on the Rue de la Lingerie, a stone's throw from the cemetery walls. The wall of this cellar, constantly damp from the saturated earth, was no longer made of stone and mortar. It had become a porous membrane, oozing a thick, black, putrid liquid. The inhabitants of that house, they didn't just smell the dead, they lived inside a tomb. They suffered from constant, racking coughs, from fevers that stole their breath. They claimed the very air was poison, and they were right. The final straw came in the spring of 1780. A particularly violent downpour, combined with the pressure from a mass grave against a cellar wall on a property bordering the cemetery, caused a catastrophic collapse. The earth gave way and the contents of the charnier, the bones, the rot, the unspeakable decay, burst forth into the basement of the home, flooding it with a tide of death. The city could no longer look away. The dead were literally breaking down the doors. The solution was as radical as it was macabre. For years, inspectors had been exploring the anciennes carrières, the ancient limestone quarries that snaked for hundreds of miles beneath the city. These were hollow, forgotten spaces, a mirror image of the streets above. The King's Council issued a decree on November 9, 1785. The cemeteries of Paris would be evacuated. The bones would be transferred to the quarries, consecrated and sealed. It was the largest, most unsettling urban renewal project in human history, and it was entrusted to a man named Charles Axel Guillemot, the Inspector General of Quarries. Guillemot was an architect, an engineer, a man of reason and order. To him, this was a logistical puzzle, a public works project of monumental scale. He didn't see ghosts, he saw structural integrity, load-bearing walls, and efficient transport. He and his team of quarrymen reinforced the crumbling tunnels, creating a vast subterranean necropolis. They built access shafts, and every night, under the cover of darkness to avoid causing a panic, a somber procession began. Black-draped wagons, accompanied by chanting priests, would carry the exhumed remains from the cemeteries to a newly opened shaft. The bones were not carefully sorted. They were dumped down the shaft into a chaotic pile of history. A duke's femur resting against a beggar's rib, a nun's skull staring blankly at a soldier's jawbone. For years, this was the process. Dump and forget. It was a practical solution, but it was not a respectful one. It was an act of architectural necessity, not spiritual grace. And it is here, in this initial period of chaotic displacement, that the first whispers began. The workers, the catacombs, were a hardened lot. They spent their lives in the dark, their faces pale, their lungs filled with stone dust. They were not prone to fancy. But stories started to trickle up to the surface, told in hushed tones in dimly lit taverns after a few glasses of cheap wine. They spoke of things seen from the corner of the eye, a shadow that darted behind a pillar just beyond the circle of lantern light, a breath of cold air in a tunnel with no draft. And the sounds. The sounds. Not just the settling of bones, they said. That was a sound you knew. This was different. One older worker, a man named Philippe with hands like granite and a missing front tooth from a tunnel collapse, claimed he was working alone, reinforcing a pillar deep in a newly consecrated section. He heard it clearly just over his shoulder. Not a moan, not a groan, a whisper. A sibilant, rushing sound like dried leaves skittering across stone, but with an intelligence behind it. It didn't form words, he said, but it carried emotion, a profound, bottomless sense of loss. He dropped his hammer and ran, not stopping until he saw the daylight of the entrance shaft, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then, in 1786, the project gained a new director, a man with a very different vision, Ricard de Toury. He saw the chaotic bone pits not just as a dump, but as a monument, a place that should inspire reflection, even macabre beauty. Under his direction, the haphazard piles of skeletons were transformed. Skulls and tibias were arranged in elaborate, almost decorative patterns. Walls of bones, punctuated by rows of skulls, became features. Columns were built from femurs, and altars were constructed, adorned with carved verses about the inevitability of death. It was during this period of artistic rearrangement that the phenomena intensified. It was as if by organizing the dead, by creating a mockery of a city for them, their presence became more focused, more coherent. The workers, now handling each bone, placing each skull with deliberate intent, became the primary witnesses. They were the ones who spent 10, 12 hours a day in the company of 6 million silent companions. Jean, a young laborer from the countryside, was tasked with stacking tibias. He was a skeptic, laughing at old Philippe's stories, but one afternoon, as he reached for a bone from the supply cart, he felt a resistance. He looked down. The bone, a long, pale femur, was cold, colder than the surrounding air. As he pulled, he swore he felt a corresponding pull from the other end. Not a physical weight, but a tension. He let go, startled. The bone clattered back onto the pile. And from the darkness behind the cart, he heard it. A soft, wet sigh. The sound a man might make with a punctured lung. Jean never laughed at the stories again. But the most chilling accounts came from the guards. After the ossuary was officially consecrated and opened for limited visits, a small contingent of watchmen was stationed at the entrances. Their job was solitude and silence. One, a former soldier named Lefebvre, kept a journal, now housed in the archives of the Carnavalet Museum. He wrote of footsteps that echoed his own, but a half step out of sync. He described the feeling of being watched by 1,000 empty eyes, a sensation so overwhelming he would sometimes have to turn his back to the bone walls to catch his breath. His most harrowing entry is dated February 12, 1793. The revolution was raging on the surface, the guillotine was busy, and the catacombs were receiving a new, fresh wave of the dead from the Place de la Révolution. Lefebvre wrote of a night when the whispers became a chorus. Not loud, but pervasive, filling the tunnels like a subterranean river. He described it as a murmuration of discontent, a sound of countless voices, each lost, each confused, each angry at their displacement. He claimed he saw them then, not bodies, not ghosts, but moving patches of a deeper darkness within the dark, swirling and coalescing in the tunnels ahead of him, retreating as he advanced with his trembling lantern. He wrote, "It is not one spirit we have angered.
It is a nation of the dead, and they are learning to speak with one voice.
This idea, this collective unrest, took root. The catacombs were not haunted by individual ghosts, but by a single, vast entity formed from the mingled memories and suffering of millions. A psychic residue given form by the sheer density of death. The folklore of Paris adopted. Parents warned disobedient children that the bone men would come for them. Lovers who dared to sneak into the tunnels for a thrill reported feeling a cold, jealous hatred emanating from the walls, as if the lonely dead resented their warmth, their life, their beating hearts. The 19th century saw the catacombs become a dark tourist attraction. Writers, poets, and aristocrats would descend on tours, seeking a frisson of terror. But even they were not immune. The acclaimed writer Victor Hugo, who drew inspiration from the tunnels for Les Miserables, noted an oppressive intelligence in the air. Another visitor, an English lord, wrote to his family that his guided tour was cut short when the entire party simultaneously heard a distinct single word whispered directly into their ears. The word was départ, leave. The guide, pale as the skulls around them, simply said, "They are restless tonight," and hurried them back to the surface. What is the truth behind the bone whispers? Were the workers and guards immersed in an environment of profound psychological stress, simply succumbing to a form of collective hysteria? The human mind is not designed to process such a landscape of death. The sheer scale of it can warp perception, turning the drip of water into a sigh, the flicker of a lamp into a moving shadow. Or did the act of moving these millions, of tearing them from their designated sanctified ground and stacking them like cordwood in a cold, dark, artificial city, create a spiritual trauma of such magnitude that it left a scar on the very fabric of the place? A place where the barrier between the living and the dead became thin and porous, where the silent, collective memory of 6 million souls, their lives, their loves, their suffering, began to echo through the stone, a low, resonant frequency of unrest that the sensitive, the lonely, or the terrified could sometimes, just sometimes, hear. The Paris Catacombs remain to this day. A small section is open to the public, but the vast majority of those 200 miles of tunnels are forbidden. The Port Mahon Gallery, the Russian bunker, the rooms with their beautiful, terrible artwork of bone are all off limits. And yet, people still sneak in, the so-called cataphiles. And their stories continue, of cameras failing, of voices recorded on otherwise empty audio tracks, of a feeling of being herded, pushed away from certain areas by an unseen, unfriendly presence. So the next time you walk the sun-drenched streets of Paris, remember the city beneath your feet. Remember the great, silent weight of history in bone, and know that silence is not always empty. Sometimes it is simply waiting, listening, and whispering back.